60 feet beneath the surface of the Atlantic, a single command is about to render every map of the Cold War obsolete. The men inside the steel hull of the USS George Washington are not just firing a weapon, they are dismantling the concept of a front line. In the silence of the control room, the order to launch marks the exact second that nuclear war stopped being a duel between nations and became a suicide pact for the species. The date is July 20, 1960. The location is 30 miles off the coast of Cape Canaveral, Florida. To the observers on the surface, ships bobbing in the swells, the ocean looks empty. There is no sign of the massive machine hovering in the deep, a vessel displacing nearly 6,000 tons of water. But down in the dark, the atmosphere is electric with a tension that has been building for 5 years. The commanding officer, Commander James Osborne, stands at the center of the control room. He is the captain of the Blue Crew, one of the 2 rotating teams assigned to man the submarine. Osborne is a veteran, a man of rigid discipline, but today he is acting as a test pilot for a system that many engineers said could never work. He is about to attempt the first underwater launch of a ballistic missile in human history. The weapon in question is the Polaris A-1. It is a solid fuel rocket standing 28 feet tall, thick as a tree trunk, and packed with enough propellant to throw a nuclear warhead over 1,000 miles. 16 of these missiles stand in vertical tubes behind the submarine's sail, a compartment the crew has nicknamed Sherwood Forest, because the tubes resemble a grove of steel redwoods painted in forest green. For the men standing watch in the missile control center, the risk is absolute. They are standing next to 16 live rockets inside a sealed pressure hull. If a missile ignites prematurely in the tube, the submarine will not just sink, it will be vaporized. If the missile jams during ejection, the heat of the friction could trigger the warhead's conventional explosives. If the missile fails to ignite after leaving the tube, it will fall back onto the deck like a stone, crushing the hull and sending the George Washington to the bottom. There are no rescue ships that can save them from a catastrophic failure at this depth. There is no abort button once the gas generator fires. The crew is locked in a metal tube with 40 tons of high explosive, betting their lives on the physics of buoyancy and thrust. The engineering challenge of an underwater launch is a nightmare of fluid dynamics. To fire a missile from a submerged platform, you cannot simply light the fuse. If the rocket engine were to ignite inside the tube, the exhaust gases would have nowhere to go. The pressure would blow the submarine apart from the inside out. Instead, the missile must be ejected cold. The system relies on a massive pulse of compressed gas, a mixture of air and steam generated by a small solid-fuel rocket motor at the base of the tube. This gas expands violently, pushing the Polaris missile upward like a piston. It is the same principle as a spitball in a straw, but scaled up to industrial proportions. The missile must leave the submarine at a speed of approximately 50 feet per second. It has to punch through the water column, breach the surface, and continue upward on momentum alone until it reaches a safe altitude. Only then, when it's clear of the water, does the first stage motor ignite. This sequence requires a precise choreography of valves and sensors. As the missile leaves the tube, a massive amount of water rushes in to fill the void. This sudden intake of weight, thousands of gallons of seawater entering the boat in a split second, threatens to destabilize the submarine. The George Washington must hover perfectly still at launch depth. If she sinks too deep, the pressure will crush the missile casing. If she broaches the surface, the element of stealth is lost. To compensate, the ship is fitted with a specialized hovering system. As the missile shoots out, high-pressure air blasts water out of a compensating tank, instantly rebalancing the weight. It is a juggling act performed with tons of steel and water, managed by an analog computer and the steady hands of the diving officer. At 12:39 p.m., Commander Osborne gives the order. The countdown reaches 0. In the missile compartment, the gas generator ignites. There is a dull, heavy thud that vibrates through the deck plates, a sound felt in the chest more than heard with the ears. The submarine shudders. The sensation is described by the crew as similar to a car driving over a heavy bump in the road. For a terrifying second, the missile is gone, but the engine has not yet fired. The Polaris A-1, named George Washington in honor of the ship, tears through the water. It breaks the surface of the Atlantic in a plume of white foam and spray. For a heartbeat, it hangs in the air, a 28-foot cylinder of metal defying gravity. It is a moment of pure vulnerability. If the engine fails now, the missile will crash back down onto the submarine's spine. Then, the first stage ignites. A tail of fire erupts from the nozzle. The roar of the rocket engine rolls across the water, deafening the observers on the support ships. The missile accelerates, climbing into the Florida sky on a pillar of smoke. It arcs over the Atlantic, its guidance system locking onto a target area hundreds of miles downrange. Inside the submarine, there is no window to watch the flight. There is only the report from the sonar operators and the confirmation from the surface ships. Bird is away. Flight is normal. The tension in the control room breaks, replaced by a profound professional relief. They have done it. They have proven that the ocean is no longer just a place for ships to sail. It is a place where the apocalypse can hide. But the test is not over. To prove the system is combat ready, they must do it again. Less than 3 hours later, the crew resets the sequence. They bring the George Washington back to hovering depth. They spin up the gyroscopes on a second missile, this one named Patrick Henry. At 3:32 p.m., the second missile erupts from the sea. It, too, flies true. The success is total. Commander Osborne drafts a message to be sent directly to President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The message is brief, coded, and historic. It reads, "Polaris, from out of the deep to target, perfect." These words signal a fundamental shift in the nature of global power. Before this moment, the nuclear standoff was a game of fixed geography. The United States had bombers on airfields and missiles in silos. The Soviet Union knew where these targets were. They could point their own missiles at them. They could calculate flight times and blast radii. But the Polaris missile has no fixed address. It moves, it hides, it can launch from anywhere in the world's oceans. By the time the George Washington returns to port, the strategic map of the world will have to be redrawn. The vessel that achieved this feat, the USS George Washington, SSBN 598, is a strange hybrid of a ship. She was not originally designed as a ballistic missile submarine. In the desperate rush to get the system to sea, the Navy cannibalized a skipjack-class attack submarine, the USS Scorpion, while she was still under construction. They cut the hull in half. They inserted a 130-foot section, the Sherwood Forest missile compartment, between the control room and the reactor. The result is a long, flat-top submarine that looks like a snake that has swallowed a brick. This Frankenstein construction was driven by fear. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik in 1957. They were testing massive hydrogen bombs. The American intelligence community believed that a missile gap was opening up, that the Soviets were building ICBMs faster than the United States. The Polaris program was the Navy's answer, a crash program that compressed a decade of development into a few frenzied years. The men who serve on her are acutely aware of this urgency. They are the 49ers, the pioneers of a new frontier. They work in a rotation system of blue and gold crews to keep the submarine at sea constantly. When the blue crew brings the ship into port, the gold crew is waiting on the pier to take over. The machine never rests. It is a permanent presence in the deep. The launch on July 20, 1960 is the culmination of this effort. It validates the billions of dollars spent, the careers risked, and the technological hurdles overcome. But as the smoke trail of the Polaris missile dissipates in the upper atmosphere, the implications of the success begin to settle over the Pentagon and the Kremlin. The impossible launch has created a new kind of war. It is a war where there are no front lines, only launch baskets. It is a war where a single vessel, commanded by a handful of men, can destroy a nation without ever surfacing. The extraordinary thing about the launch was how quickly the extraordinary became routine. Within months, the George Washington would deploy on her first deterrent patrol. She would load 16 nuclear-tipped Polaris missiles, each one carrying a warhead with the destructive power of 64,000 tons of TNT, and vanish into the Atlantic. For 66 days, she would remain submerged. Her crew would live in the artificial light, breathing recycled air, moving quietly through the deep. They would not be testing a system, they would be holding the world hostage. The successful test off Cape Canaveral did more than just prove a technology, it proved a concept. It demonstrated that the ocean could be weaponized in a way that no treaty could control and no defense could stop. The missile that left the tube that afternoon was a messenger. It carried a warning to Moscow that the United States had found a way to strike from the one place the Soviets could not guard, the empty, indifferent ocean. As Commander Osborne orders the George Washington to secure from battle stations and return to cruising depth, he is likely unaware of the full scope of what he has just initiated. He has done his job, he has followed his orders, but he has also turned the key on a door that can never be closed. The silence returns to the submarine. The pumps hum. The reactor drives the turbines. The George Washington slips away into the darkness, a predator that has found its teeth. The age of the bomber is ending. The age of the silo is fading. The age of the boomer has begun. History held its breath for those few seconds while the missile hovered in the water column, caught between the pressure of the deep and the freedom of the sky. Now, history exhales, and the world it breathes into is colder, darker, and infinitely more dangerous. When the Polaris missile erupted from the ocean off Cape Canaveral in July 1960, it did more than break the surface of the water. It broke the logic that had governed warfare since the dawn of time. For thousands of years, military strategy was dictated by geography. To attack an enemy, you had to cross a physical distance. You had to march an army, sail a fleet, or fly a bomber wing from point A to point B. This movement took time, and that time was the defender's most valuable asset. It allowed for detection, for interception, and for preparation. But the weaponization of the deep ocean erased the concept of distance. It collapsed the timeline of the apocalypse from hours down to minutes. To understand the magnitude of this shift, one must look at the nuclear map as it existed before the USS George Washington. In the 1950s, the architecture of the Cold War was rigid and visible. The United States relied on the Strategic Air Command, massive fleets of B-52 and B-47 bombers stationed at air bases around the world. These bases were known entities. The Soviet Union knew exactly where they were. If a war started, Soviet missiles would target these airfields first, hoping to catch the American bombers on the ground. The second leg of the deterrent, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, ICBM, was equally static. The Atlas and Titan missiles were housed in reinforced silos buried in the American Midwest. Like the air bases, these silos were fixed points on a map. They were hard targets, but they were targets nonetheless. A sufficiently accurate Soviet strike could dig them out. This created a terrifying instability known as the first strike temptation. If Soviet planners believed they could destroy the American bombers and silos in a single surprise attack, they might be tempted to try. The logic of the 1950s was a duel of quick-draw gunfighters. The side that fired first had a mathematical chance of winning. The side that hesitated would be disarmed and destroyed. The submarine-launched ballistic missile, SLBM, shattered this equation. The USS George Washington and the 41 for Freedom, the fleet of ballistic missile submarines that followed her, introduced a variable that could not be solved by Soviet mathematics. A submarine on patrol has no fixed address. It is a moving coordinate in a three-dimensional void. It can hide in the acoustic shadows of the mid-Atlantic ridge, under the noise of a merchant convoy, or beneath the thermal layers of the Arctic. This mobility birthed the concept of second strike capability. This is the strategic bedrock upon which modern civilization rests. It is the guarantee that no matter how successful a surprise attack might be, no matter how many cities are vaporized or how many silos are crushed, the aggressor will not survive the retaliation. If the Soviet Union launched a perfect first strike and wiped the United States off the map, the submarines would still be there. They would be deep, silent, and untouched. And 15 minutes later, they would rise to launch depth and burn the Soviet Union down to the bedrock. This certainty made nuclear war unwinnable. It removed the incentive to strike first, replacing the hair-trigger instability of the 1950s with the grim, frozen stalemate of mutually assured destruction. The ocean became the stabilizer of the world, a vast, wet blanket that smothered the flames of World War III before they could ignite. But if the submarine made the world safer in a strategic sense, it made the tactical reality infinitely more terrifying. The ocean was no longer a transit route for commerce or a barrier against invasion. It was transformed into a hiding place for Armageddon. The geography of the Atlantic and the Arctic ceased to be defined by currents and shipping lanes. Instead, it was redrawn into launch baskets. These were vast areas of the ocean where a submarine could sit and still reach its targets in Moscow, Leningrad, or Kiev. With the advent of the Polaris A1, with its range of 1,200 nautical miles, a submarine had to get relatively close, the Norwegian Sea or the North Atlantic. But as missile technology improved to the A3 and eventually the Poseidon, the range extended to 2,500 miles and beyond. The launch baskets expanded until they covered almost the entire ocean. A submarine could be on vacation in the South Atlantic and still be a threat to the Kremlin. This expansion of the battlefield overwhelmed the Soviet defenses. You cannot fence off the entire Atlantic Ocean. You cannot patrol every square mile of the Pacific. The needle was too small, and the haystack was the size of the planet. However, the most chilling change was not where the missiles came from, but when they would arrive. In the era of the bomber, the warning time for a nuclear attack was measured in hours. Radar stations in the Arctic would pick up the incoming waves of aircraft, giving the defender time to scramble fighters and evacuate leaders. With the advent of the land-based ICBM, that warning time shrank to about 30 minutes, the time it takes for a rocket to fly over the North Pole from Russia to America, or vice versa. The submarine slashed that time in half. A ballistic missile submarine operating off the coast of Europe or in the Arctic could deliver a warhead to Moscow in approximately 13 minutes. 13 minutes. This is the 13-minute war. It is a span of time so short that it precludes human deliberation. If a Soviet early warning radar detected a launch from the Norwegian Sea, the leadership in Moscow would have less than 10 minutes to decide if the attack was real. By the time they verified the signal, woke the general secretary, and opened the nuclear suitcase, the warheads would already be detonating. This compression of time changed the psychology of the Kremlin. It stripped away the illusion of control. The Soviet leadership realized that they were living with a gun pressed constantly against their temple. The trigger could be pulled at any moment from a location they could not see by a commander they did not know. The flight profile of a submarine-launched missile added to the terror. An ICBM flies a high, predictable arc through space. It is easier to track. An SLBM fired from close range flies a depressed trajectory. It stays lower, faster, and arrives with less warning. It is a knife thrust from the dark rather than a stone thrown from a distance. The George Washington was capable of firing 16 missiles in roughly 15 minutes. Each missile carried a single W-47 warhead with a yield of 600 kilotons, 40 times the power of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. One submarine carried more destructive power than all the bombs dropped in World War II combined, and the United States was building 41 of them. The strategic message sent by the launch of the Polaris was deafening, though it was delivered in silence. There was no parade in Red Square, no bluster at the United Nations. The message was the technology itself. It said to the Soviet Union, "We have moved the war to a place where you cannot fight it. We have hidden the end of the world in the water, and you will never find it." This realization fundamentally altered the Soviet economy and military doctrine. They could not ignore the threat. They had to respond. But how do you respond to a ghost? You cannot build a wall in the ocean. You cannot shoot down a submarine with a surface-to-air missile. The only response was to try to match the capability. The Soviet Union had to build its own fleet of missile submarines. They had to build their own city killers and hide them off the coast of the United States. They had to enter a race that was not just about building bombs, but about mastering the most hostile environment on Earth. The George Washington had proven that the concept worked. Now, the Soviets had to prove they could do it too. But the Americans had a head start. They had a superior industrial base, better electronics, and the genius of the Rickover Navy, a culture of engineering discipline that ensured their reactors worked and their crews survived. The Soviets had none of these advantages. They had ambition, they had fear, and they had a command economy that could pour endless rubles into the military. But they lacked the time. They were running a race against a competitor who had already crossed the starting line while they were still tying their shoes. This desperation would drive the next phase of the story. It would force the Soviet Union to cut corners, to rush designs, and to push their engineers beyond the limits of safety. The success of the American Polaris program would lead directly to the tragedies of the Soviet fleet. As the George Washington prowled the Atlantic on her first deterrent patrol in late 1960, she was a silent, brooding presence. Her crew practiced their drills, battle stations missile, until the sequence was muscle memory. They lived in the artificial rhythm of the 18-hour day, isolated from the sun and the news. They were the tip of the spear, but they were also the shield. They knew that as long as they remained hidden, the world was safe. Their invisibility was the guarantee of peace. If they were ever forced to fire, they would have failed in their primary mission, which was simply to exist. The ocean had become a hiding place for death, but in doing so, it had also become the sanctuary of life. By making war mutually suicidal, the submarine force had frozen the conflict in place. But in Moscow, the ice was cracking. The intelligence reports landing on Nikita Khrushchev's desk were painting a picture of catastrophic vulnerability. The Soviet Union was naked. The American missiles were already at sea, and the Soviet counterparts were still on the drawing board. The panic was setting in. The reaction would be violent, hurried, and tragic. The United States had launched a missile. The Soviet Union was about to launch a disaster. The 13-minute war was hypothetical, but the casualties of the race to prepare for it were about to become very real. While the champagne corks were popping in the officers' wardroom of the USS George Washington off the coast of Florida, a very different kind of bottle was being opened in the Kremlin. It was not a celebration, it was a wake for the Soviet strategic advantage. The intelligence reports arriving on the desk of Premier Nikita Khrushchev in the late summer of 1960 were not filled with technical jargon or ambiguous data. They painted a picture of absolute clarity. The United States had just checkmated the Soviet Union in the opening move of the underwater arms race. To understand the depth of the panic that seized the Soviet leadership, one must appreciate the precarious psychology of the Kremlin. At the dawn of the 1960s, the Soviet Union projected an image of monolithic strength. They had beaten the Americans into space with Sputnik. They had detonated the Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear weapon ever tested. They paraded thousands of tanks through Red Square every May Day. But behind the facade of steel and concrete, the Soviet strategists knew the truth. They were encircled. The geography of the Cold War was suffocating them. American bomber bases in Turkey, Japan, and Western Europe formed a ring of steel around the motherland. The U.S. Navy controlled the shipping lanes. And now, with the advent of the Polaris missile, the Americans had erased the oceans as a buffer zone. The launch of the George Washington was a shock not just because it worked, but because of how well it worked. Soviet intelligence had assumed that submarine-launched ballistic missiles were a decade away. They believed the engineering challenges of firing a rocket through water were insurmountable in the short term. Seeing the Americans do it flawlessly and then deploy the system immediately was a humiliation. The Soviet reaction was a mixture of professional admiration and political terror. The naval staff, led by the visionary but ruthless Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, recognized immediately that the Polaris submarine was a system of systems that the USSR could not match. It wasn't just the missile, it was the submarine's endurance, the silence of the nuclear plant, the precision of the navigation computers, and the reliability of the solid fuel. The Soviet Union had none of these things. Their computers were vacuum tube dinosaurs. Their manufacturing tolerances were loose. Their solid fuel chemistry was in its infancy. They were trying to build a Ferrari with the tools used to build a tractor. But Khrushchev was not a man interested in engineering excuses. He was a leader defined by his volatility and his obsession with missile superiority. He had famously dismissed the surface navy as floating metal coffins, preferring to pour resources into the strategic rocket forces, the land-based ICBMs. He believed that the future of war was rockets, not ships. The success of Polaris forced a brutal pivot. The Navy admirals argued correctly that land-based missiles were vulnerable targets. If the Americans could strike from the ocean, the Soviets needed to be able to do the same. They needed a second strike insurance policy. Khrushchev, realizing the strategic imbalance, reversed course. He demanded a fleet of nuclear-powered missile submarines, and he demanded them yesterday. This political directive set off an industrial stampede that would have tragic consequences. In the United States, the Polaris program was driven by the Rickover doctrine, a philosophy of rigorous testing, redundant safety systems, and absolute quality control. Admiral Rickover famously said, "The devil is in the details, but so is salvation." He would shut down a project for months if a weld was improper. In the Soviet Union, the doctrine was the plan. The 5-year plan was law. Quotas were mandatory. Deadlines were tied to political holidays, the anniversary of the revolution, the birthday of Lenin. To miss a deadline was to risk your career, your party membership, and perhaps your freedom. The result was a design philosophy of frantic adaptation. The Soviet engineers did not have time to design a ballistic missile submarine from scratch. They didn't have time to build a prototype, test it, refine it, and then build the fleet. They had to build the fleet now. So they improvised. They took the designs for their existing nuclear attack submarine, the Project 627 November class, and hacked it apart. They inserted a missile compartment into the hull, much like the Americans had done with the George Washington. But unlike the Americans, who had a sleek, integrated design, the Soviets created a monster. The result was Project 658. NATO codenamed it the Hotel class. On paper, the Hotel looked like a competitor to the George Washington. It was nuclear-powered. It carried 3 R-13 ballistic missiles. It could patrol the Atlantic. But in reality, it was a technological dead end masquerading as a warship. The primary flaw was the missile system itself. The Americans had mastered solid fuel and underwater ejection. The Soviets were still stuck with liquid fuel. The R-13 missile was filled with volatile kerosene and nitric acid oxidizer. These chemicals were corrosive, toxic, and prone to explosion. Carrying them on a submarine was like carrying 3 ticking bombs strapped to the conning tower. Worse, the R-13 could not be fired underwater. This was the fatal weakness of the Hotel class. To launch its missiles, the submarine had to surface. It had to break the water, raise the missile tubes, stabilize the ship in the waves, and then fire. The entire process took nearly 15 minutes. In the context of the 13-minute war, this was suicidal. A surfacing submarine is a loud, visible target. The moment a Hotel-class boat breached the surface to fire, it would be detected by American radar and sonar. It would be vulnerable to attack by aircraft, destroyers, and other submarines. The Soviet captain would have to sit on the surface, exposed and helpless, while his crew frantically prepared the launch. The Americans had a sniper rifle that could shoot from cover. The Soviets had a musket that required them to stand up in the middle of the battlefield to load. Despite these glaring tactical flaws, the Kremlin ordered mass production. The shipyards at Severodvinsk were turned into 24-hour factories. The pressure on the workers was immense. Quality control began to slip. Welds were inspected visually rather than with X-rays. Valves were installed without proper testing. Electrical wiring was routed through spaces that were prone to flooding. This divergent engineering philosophy created a chasm between the two superpowers. The U.S. Navy spent money to buy reliability. The Soviet Navy spent lives to buy time. The Soviet designers knew they were building flawed ships. They knew the radiation shielding was too light. They knew the reactor control rods were prone to jamming, but they had no choice. The political leadership demanded parity, and parity was measured in the number of hulls in the water, not the safety of the crews inside them. The rush extended to the human element as well. The crews for these new submarines were assembled hastily. There was no time for the rigorous, year-long training pipelines used by the U.S. Navy. Soviet sailors, many of them conscripts serving mandatory terms, were given crash courses in nuclear physics and submarine operations. They were sent to sea in machines they barely understood, commanded by officers who were under intense pressure to report success at any cost. By late 1960, the first Hotel-class boats were entering service. They were impressive to look at, long, menacing black shapes with a massive sail housing the missiles. They gave the Soviet Union the propaganda victory it needed. They could point to the ocean and say, "We are there too." But inside the hull, the reality was grim. The Hotel class was noisy. The machinery rattled and hummed, making the submarine easy to track. The radiation levels in the reactor compartment were constantly elevated. Leaks were common. The crews lived in a state of constant, low-level emergency. The strategic panic in Moscow had produced a fleet, but it was a Potemkin village of the deep. It looked powerful from the outside, but it was structurally unsound. The Soviet Union had managed to match the American presence in the Atlantic, but they had done so by deploying ships that were more dangerous to their own crews than they were to the United States. This environment of haste, secrecy, and political pressure set the stage for the inevitable. You cannot cheat physics forever. If you build a nuclear reactor without a backup cooling system, eventually it will overheat. If you put liquid fuel missiles in a vibrating hull, eventually they will leak. The first casualty of the Soviet rush would not be an American city, but a Soviet crew. Among the new Hotel-class submarines being rushed to completion was the K-19. She was the first of her kind, the lead ship of the class. She was meant to be the pride of the fleet. But in the shipyards, the workers whispered that she was cursed. Men died during her construction, fires, accidents, falling equipment. When she was launched, the champagne bottle failed to break against her hull, a maritime omen of bad luck. But the Soviet leadership did not believe in omens, they believed in schedules. K-19 was commissioned, loaded with missiles and a raw crew, and sent into the North Atlantic to prove that the Soviet Union could stand toe-to-toe with the Americans. She sailed into the ocean carrying the burden of a nation's insecurity. She was a weapon forged in panic, welded by exhaustion, and commanded by fear. She was supposed to be the answer to the George Washington. Instead, she would become a warning to the world. The panic in Moscow had birthed a monster, and now the monster was hungry. The K-19 was heading for the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, sailing toward a destiny that would earn her a new name among the sailors of the Northern Fleet. They would not call her the K-19, they would call her the Widowmaker. On July 4, 1961, deep in the North Atlantic, the Cold War came within a single broken pipe of turning hot. The Soviet submarine K-19 was patrolling off the coast of Greenland, participating in the Circle of Honor exercise. To the casual observer, she was a predator, a ballistic missile submarine simulating a nuclear strike on the United States. But inside the hull, she was about to become a victim of her own hurried creation. The K-19 was the lead ship of the Hotel class, the vessel built to answer the George Washington. She was sleek, fast, and armed with 3 megaton-class warheads, but she was also a machine built by men who were afraid of missing a deadline. The welders at Severodvinsk had worked too fast, the engineers had cut too many corners, and on this Independence Day, the bill for that haste arrived. At 04:15, the pressure in the starboard reactor's primary cooling loop dropped to 0. A pipe had ruptured. The coolant, pressurized water circulating at high speed to strip heat away from the uranium core, flashed into steam and vented into the reactor compartment. The pumps screamed as they spun in a vacuum. The flow of water stopped. In the control room, Captain Nikolai Zateyev watched the gauges with a growing horror. The reactor had scrammed, the control rods had dropped to stop the fission reaction, but the core was not cold. A nuclear reactor is not like a car engine. It does not stop generating heat the moment you turn the key. The fuel rods were still producing decay heat, the thermal energy released by the radioactive breakdown of fission byproducts. Without coolant, the temperature in the core began to climb, 300 degrees Celsius, 400 degrees, 800 degrees. Zateyev turned to his engineering officer and asked the question that would define the rest of his life. Where is the backup cooling system? The answer was a silence that screamed, there was no backup system. In their rush to launch the ship, the Soviet designers had omitted a redundant emergency cooling loop. They had assumed the primary system was robust enough, they had gambled on perfection, and they had lost. The situation was apocalyptic. As the temperature climbed toward 1,000 degrees, the fuel rods would begin to melt. The uranium would turn into a molten slag, burning through the bottom of the reactor vessel. If that molten metal hit the water in the bilge, it would trigger a steam explosion powerful enough to tear the hull apart. But the danger went beyond the loss of the ship. K-19 was carrying 3 R-13 nuclear missiles in her sail, mere feet from the reactor compartment. The heat was already radiating through the bulkheads. If the warheads cooked off, or if the steam explosion scattered radioactive debris across the North Atlantic, the explosion would look exactly like a nuclear weapon detonation. NATO listening posts would detect it. American early warning satellites would see the flash. In the tense, paranoid atmosphere of 1961, there would be no time for explanations. The United States might interpret the destruction of K-19 as an attempted first strike that went wrong or a Soviet attack on a NATO ship. The retaliation would be airborne before the submarine hit the bottom. Zateyev realized he was not just trying to save his ship, he was trying to save the world. There was only one solution. The engineers proposed a desperate, improvised plan. They would take a stockpile of fresh water stored in the ship's tanks, cut into a ventilation pipe connected to the reactor, and weld a new line to pump water directly onto the melting core. It was a plumbing job that required precision, heavy tools, and time. But the pipe they needed to cut was inside the reactor compartment. The reactor compartment was a hellscape. It was filled with radioactive steam. The radiation levels were spiking to levels that Geiger counters could barely register, thousands of Roentgens per hour. A human being entering that room would not just be exposed to radiation, they would be bombarded by a neutron flux that would tear their DNA apart in minutes. There were no heavy radiation suits on board. The crew had only standard chemical warfare suits, thin, rubberized canvas designed to stop mustard gas, not gamma rays. Entering the compartment was a death sentence. Zaitiev did not order men to go. He asked for volunteers. A team of young sailors stepped forward. They were the engineering specialists, the men who knew the machinery best. Lieutenant Boris Korchilov, a handsome, popular officer, led the first team. He looked at his captain, saluted, and stepped through the heavy steel door. Inside the reactor room, the scene was nightmarish. The air was glowing with a blue ionization haze, the Cherenkov effect manifesting in the steam. The heat was suffocating. Korchilov and his men worked in 10-minute shifts, wielding welding torches with hands that were already beginning to swell. They were welding the lid of a Pandora's box while standing inside it. The radiation was a physical assault. They could taste the ozone in the air. They felt a prickling on their skin. Within minutes, they began to vomit, the first violent sign of acute radiation syndrome. Their bodies were recognizing that they were being killed on a cellular level. But they kept working. Team after team went in. They cut the pipe, they dragged the hose, they welded the flange, they built a cooling system from scrap metal and courage, working in an environment more hostile than the surface of the moon. Finally, the weld was complete. The pumps were engaged. Cold water rushed into the reactor vessel. In the control room, the crew watched the temperature gauge. It hesitated. Then, slowly, it began to fall. The core was cooling. The meltdown was averted. The missiles were safe. But as the temperature dropped, the human cost rose. The men who had gone into the reactor compartment were brought out looking like ghosts. Their faces were flushed red, a nuclear tan caused by the bursting of capillaries under the skin. They were delirious with pain. The ship's doctor, who had no training for this level of trauma, could do nothing but give them morphine. The ventilation system, which had been left running to clear the smoke, had spread radioactive aerosols throughout the entire submarine. The K-19 was now a floating radiologic weapon. The drinking water was contaminated. The air was poison. Captain Zaitiev turned the ship toward home. He radioed for help, breaking silence, desperate to get his dying men to a hospital. A Soviet diesel submarine rendezvoused with them, taking off the most critical casualties. When the survivors were transferred, the sailors on the rescue boat recoiled in horror. The men of the repair team were disintegrating. Their skin was sloughing off. They were bleeding from their gums. They were conscious, but they were already dead. Their bodies just hadn't finished the process. Lieutenant Korchilov died days later in a Moscow hospital. He was buried in a lead-lined coffin, soldered shut because his corpse was too radioactive to be placed in the earth. 5 other members of the repair team followed him within weeks. The Soviet government did what it always did. It buried the truth along with the men. The disaster was classified top secret. The survivors were sworn to silence. There were no medals for saving the world, only threats of the gulag if they spoke. The official cause of death for the sailors was listed as structural damage to the organism, a euphemism for being dissolved by radiation. The K-19 was towed back to Polyarny. She was decontaminated, repaired, and sent back to sea. The Soviet Navy could not afford to lose a hull, but the ship was marked. The sailors of the Northern Fleet gave her a new name. They called her Hiroshima. She became a pariah ship, a vessel that seemed to attract bad luck. Fires, collisions, and accidents plagued her career. She was the ghost at the feast of Soviet naval power, a constant reminder of the price of the rush. The disaster of K-19 was the turning point for the Soviet submarine force, though the lesson took decades to fully sink in. It exposed the lie of the hotel class. The Soviets had built a fleet that looked like the American fleet, but they had not built the safety culture to support it. They had copied the form of the George Washington, but not the substance. The frantic effort to match the Americans had produced a weapon that was more dangerous to its crew than to the enemy. K-19 had almost caused the war she was built to prevent. This realization forced a strategic retreat. The Soviet leadership understood that they could not win a head-to-head technological race in the open ocean. Their submarines were too loud, too unreliable, and too dangerous. They could not safely patrol off the coast of New York. The 13-minute war was a capability they possessed on paper, but in reality, their delivery systems were falling apart. So they changed the strategy. If they couldn't go to the Americans, they would force the Americans to come to them. They would stop trying to hide in the vastness of the Atlantic and instead hide in their own backyard. They looked north, to the ice. The K-19 disaster birthed the bastion concept. The Soviet Navy decided to retreat behind the defensive perimeter of the Barents Sea and the Arctic Ocean. They would build fences of mines and surface ships. They would keep their ballistic missile submarines close to home, where they could be protected and where a reactor accident wouldn't trigger a diplomatic crisis with NATO. It was an admission of defeat disguised as a change in tactics. They had lost the battle for the open ocean. The Americans owned the deep Atlantic. The Soviets would settle for owning the ice. But the legacy of K-19 lingered. The Widowmaker continued to sail, a rusted, irradiated testament to the hubris of the early Cold War. For the men who served on her, the memory was not of strategic theories or missile ranges. It was of the smell of ozone, the blue flash of the welder, and the sight of their friends walking willingly into a room they knew they would never truly leave. The first shot of the new war had been fired by the George Washington, a triumph of engineering. The response from the Soviet Union was K-19, a tragedy of engineering. The Americans had launched a missile, the Soviets had sacrificed a crew. And as the Cold War ground on, the ocean floor waited. It had been spared a nuclear explosion this time. But the game was getting more dangerous, the missiles were getting bigger, the reactors were getting more powerful. And the next time a submarine died, there might not be a Boris Korchalov to weld the pipe. The return of the radioactive wreck of K-19 to the Kola Peninsula marked the end of the Soviet dream of dominating the open Atlantic. The disaster had proved with brutal clarity that the Soviet Navy could not sustain high-tempo operations thousands of miles from home using first-generation nuclear technology. Their submarines were powerful, but they were fragile. They were sprinters trying to run a marathon, and they were breaking down before they reached the finish line. In the windowless rooms of the Soviet Admiralty, a profound strategic reassessment began. The admirals looked at the map of the North Atlantic. They saw the Greenland-Iceland United Kingdom, gap, the narrow choke point through which their submarines had to pass to reach the American coast. They saw the expanding network of American SOSUS listening arrays on the ocean floor, which could hear a noisy Soviet submarine the moment it entered deep water. And they saw the logistical nightmare of supporting a fleet that was prone to reactor failures and fires. They realized they had lost the battle for the blue water, the deep, open ocean. The Americans owned the Atlantic. Their George Washington and Ethan Allen-class submarines could patrol for months in total silence, undetectable and unreachable. The Soviets could not match this capability. If they continued to send their loud, unreliable hotel-class boats into the teeth of NATO's anti-submarine defenses, they would be slaughtered in the opening minutes of a war. So, the Soviet Union did something unexpected. They stopped running. They developed a new doctrine known as the bastion strategy. Instead of sending their ballistic missile submarines to the enemy, they would keep them home. They would turn the marginal seas of the Arctic, the Barents Sea, the Kara Sea, and the Sea of Okhotsk into fortified maritime citadels. They would retreat behind a wall of ice. The logic was defensive but effective. By keeping their missile submarines close to the Soviet coast, they could protect them with the full weight of their surface fleet and naval aviation. A hotel-class submarine didn't need to be quiet if it was surrounded by friendly destroyers and protected by minefields. It just needed to float long enough to launch. Crucially, the geography of the Arctic provided the ultimate shield, the polar ice cap. American spy satellites could not see through ice. American patrol planes could not drop sonobuoys through ice. The chaotic acoustic environment of the shifting ice pack masked the noise of the Soviet engines. The Soviet Navy effectively ceded the world's oceans to the United States in exchange for securing a fortress in the north. They withdrew their strategic bombers from the front lines and placed them in a bunker made of frozen water. This shift fundamentally altered the nature of the Cold War. It turned the Arctic Ocean into the most heavily militarized space on the planet. But it also highlighted the widening chasm between the two superpowers, not just in strategy, but in the very philosophy of how they built the machines of the apocalypse. The divergence began in 1963. In that year, the United States Navy suffered its own catastrophe, the loss of the USS Thresher. The Thresher was the most advanced attack submarine in the world, but she sank during a deep diving test, taking 129 men to the bottom. The American reaction to the Thresher disaster was a total systemic arrest. The Navy stopped. They launched the SubSafe program, a draconian quality assurance protocol driven by Admiral Hyman Rickover. They re-inspected every submarine in the fleet. They ripped out piping, re-welded joints, and rewrote the manuals. They accepted a temporary reduction in fleet readiness to ensure that when a ship went to sea, it was perfect. The American philosophy was safety first, mission second. They believed that a dead submarine provides no deterrence. They invested billions in quality control, precision milling, and noise reduction. They treated silence as a commodity more valuable than speed. The Soviet reaction to K-19 and the subsequent disasters that plagued their fleet was the exact opposite. The Soviet Union was a command economy driven by quotas. The 5-year plan demanded a specific number of hulls in the water. The factory managers at Severodvinsk and Komsomolsk-on-Amur were paid based on tonnage launched, not on hours of maintenance-free operation. When K-19 failed, the Soviets did not stop to reinvent their quality control. They accelerated production. They believed that quantity has a quality all its own. If one submarine broke down, they would build 2 more to replace it. If a reactor was unreliable, they would send a mechanic with a wrench, not redesign the core. This created a navy that was massive but hollow. By the mid-1970s, the Soviet submarine force was numerically superior to the U.S. Navy, but physically inferior. Their submarines were faster and deeper diving, thanks to the use of titanium hulls and overpowering reactors, but they were loud. In the underwater war, noise is death. American sonar operators jokingly referred to Soviet submarines as bucket of bolts or locomotives. They could track a hotel or Echo-class submarine from hundreds of miles away. The Soviet boats vibrated, their pumps whined, their propellers cavitated. This lack of acoustic discipline was not just a technical failure, it was a cultural one. The Soviet system did not empower the individual craftsman. A welder in Groton, Connecticut, who saw a flaw would stop the line. A welder in Severodvinsk who saw a flaw would likely cover it up, terrified of missing his quota or being accused of sabotage. The authoritarian state produced brittle steel. The bastion strategy was an admission of this weakness. The Soviets knew their ships were loud. They knew they couldn't hide in the open ocean, so they hid in the noise of their own backyard. However, the missile gap remained. To make the bastion strategy work, the Soviets needed missiles with enough range to hit Washington, D.C. from the North Pole. The early R-13 liquid fuel missiles on the Hotel class had a range of only a few hundred miles. This forced them to leave the bastion, which exposed them to attack. The Soviet industrial complex responded with a crash program to build longer-range missiles. They succeeded with the R-29 SSN-8 missile, which could travel over 4,000 miles. This weapon allowed the new Delta-class submarines to sit at the pier in Murmansk and still target the American seaboard. The Delta was the ultimate expression of the bastion concept. It was a massive, ungainly submarine with a huge hump on its back to house the long-range missiles. It didn't need to be fast or quiet. It just needed to be a floating silo. But even as the Soviets secured their fortress of ice, the ghost of K-19 continued to haunt them. The systemic neglect of safety protocols meant that even inside the bastion, the submarines were dying. Fires continued to break out. Reactors continued to scram. In 1968, a Gulf-class submarine, K-129, sank in the Pacific due to a missile explosion or battery failure. In 1970, the K-8 sank in the Bay of Biscay due to a short circuit. The Soviet Navy became a force of attrition. They lost more sailors in peacetime accidents than the U.S. Navy lost in combat during the entire Vietnam War. The crews of the Northern Fleet lived a life of grim fatalism. They knew they were sailing in steel coffins. They knew the radiation shielding was inadequate. They knew the escape pods were often welded shut to prevent leaks, yet they sailed. The political pressure from the Kremlin never abated. The Cold War was a numbers game, and the Soviet Union was determined to match the American missile count warhead for warhead, regardless of the human cost. The contrast between the two systems was starkest in the reactor compartments. In an American submarine, the reactor was a jewel of engineering, sealed, safe, and heavily instrumented. The crew trusted it. In a Soviet submarine, the reactor was a beast to be tamed. It required constant manual intervention. It leaked. It overheated. It was a source of fear, not power. This disparity had strategic consequences. American submarines could deploy for 90 days, stay submerged the entire time, and return with a crew that was tired but healthy. Soviet submarines struggled to maintain patrols of 60 days. They often had to surface to vent toxic gases or repair machinery. Their operational availability, the percentage of time a ship is actually ready to fight, was abysmal, often hovering around 15 to 20% compared to the American 60-70%. The 13-minute war scenario, the fear of a sudden strike from the sea, was real, but the Soviet capability to execute it was always less than it appeared. They had the missiles, but they struggled to keep the launch platforms alive. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the technology gap widened. The Americans introduced digital computers, towed array sonar, and the quiet Los Angeles-class submarines. The Soviets responded with the massive Typhoon class, monsters the size of aircraft carriers, built to break through the thickest ice of the Arctic. The Typhoon was the apotheosis of the Soviet philosophy, sheer size and brute force used to overcome a lack of precision. It was a terrifying machine carrying 20 ballistic missiles, but it was also a logistical nightmare, ruinously expensive to maintain. The Bastion strategy worked in the sense that it preserved the Soviet second strike capability. The U.S. Navy admitted that hunting Soviet boomers under the ice was difficult and dangerous. The Arctic remained a sanctuary, but the cost of maintaining that sanctuary broke the back of the Soviet economy. The relentless demand for more titanium, more uranium, and more steel to build these disposable leviathans drained the treasury. The Soviet Union was spending nearly 20% of its GDP on defense, while its citizens stood in line for bread. The K-19 disaster had been a warning: you cannot cheat physics. The Bastion strategy was a warning: you cannot cheat economics. By the late 1980s, the Soviet submarine fleet was the largest in the world, but it was a hollow armada. It was rotting from the inside out, eating the nation that built it. The race that began with the George Washington and the Hotel class had turned into a marathon of endurance, and the Soviet Union, having sprinted the first 10 miles, was collapsing. The fortress of ice had protected the missiles, but it could not protect the state. As the Berlin Wall fell and the red flag was lowered, the nuclear reactors of the Northern Fleet continued to hum in the darkness of the polar night. The crews, unpaid and demoralized, kept their watch. They were the guardians of a superpower that no longer existed. The final irony of the Cold War at sea was that the Soviet Union didn't lose because its submarines were sunk in battle. It lost because it built submarines it couldn't afford to maintain in a race it couldn't afford to run. The ocean had been weaponized, but the weapon had recoiled. Now, as the Cold War ended, the question shifted. The threat was no longer a deliberate launch. The threat was the legacy. What happens to 100 nuclear reactors when the empire that built them disappears? What happens to the widowmakers when there is no one left to pay for the repairs? The invisible war was over. The invisible cleanup was about to begin. In the wet, gray climate of the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, Washington, the history of the world is dismantled one steel plate at a time. It is here, in the sprawling industrial complex of the Pacific Northwest, that the United States Navy sends its nuclear-powered ships to die. The process is clinical, brutal, and devoid of ceremony. The reactor compartments are cut out, sealed in massive steel casts, and barged down the Columbia River to be buried in the high desert of Hanford. The hulls are sliced into sections by plasma torches, the high-yield steel recycled into rebar or razor blades. In the mid-1980s, one specific hull arrived at this graveyard. It was the USS George Washington. To a historian, this vessel was as significant as the Santa Maria or the Spirit of St. Louis. She was the ship that changed the geometry of war. She was the platform that fired the first shot of the new era, the machine that proved the ocean could hide the apocalypse. By any reasonable standard of heritage, she should have been preserved. She should have been moored in the Potomac or the Hudson, a museum ship where children could walk the decks and touch the tubes that once held the power to end civilization. But the George Washington was not saved. She was erased. There is no museum for the George Washington. There is no monument. Her sail was saved and placed in a park in Connecticut, but the ship herself, the pressure hull, the missile compartment, the reactor room, was cut into scrap metal. This erasure was not an act of disrespect, it was an act of necessity. The treaties that ended the Cold War, SALT and START, demanded verification. When a strategic weapon is retired, the enemy must be able to verify its destruction. The United States could not simply hide the George Washington in a museum. They had to prove to the Soviet Union that she could never launch a missile again, so the first shot was melted down. The fate of the George Washington symbolizes the strange, invisible nature of the submarine war. It is a conflict that takes place entirely out of sight, and its veterans, both human and mechanical, often disappear without a trace. The public sees the aircraft carriers and the tanks. They do not see the black hulls sliding into the deep water at night. But while the steel of the first generation is gone, the legacy is more powerful than ever. The concept pioneered by the George Washington, the continuous at-sea deterrent, has become the bedrock of global security. Today, the United States Navy operates the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines. These are the direct descendants of the George Washington. But they operate on a scale that makes their ancestor look like a toy. An Ohio submarine is 560 feet long. It displaces 18,000 tons. It moves through the water with the silence of a hole in the ocean. Instead of the primitive Polaris A-1 with its single warhead and limited range, the Ohio carries the Trident II D-5 missile. This weapon has a range of over 7,000 miles. It carries multiple independent warheads, EMERVs, that can steer themselves to within feet of a target. A single Ohio-class submarine carries more destructive power than was unleashed in the entire history of human warfare, from the invention of gunpowder to the present day. And just like in 1960, the system never rests. At any given moment, somewhere in the Atlantic or the Pacific, American boomers are on patrol. They are moving at 3 knots, trailing sonar arrays, listening to the ocean. Their crews are living the same 18-hour days, breathing the same recycled air, waiting for the same encrypted message that Commander Osborne waited for 60 years ago. The Soviet Union is gone, but the Russian Navy remains. After the collapse of the 1990s, the Russians rebuilt their force. They scrapped the noisy Hotel and Yankee classes. They retired the massive, expensive Typhoons. In their place, they built the Borei class. The Borei is the Russian answer to the Ohio. It is quiet, fast, and armed with the Bulava missile. It patrols the same bastions in the Arctic that were established after the K-19 disaster. The game of cat and mouse continues, played by new ships with better computers, but the rules are the same. This is the invisible legacy. The Cold War did not end under the water, it just got quieter. The divergence in engineering philosophies that defined the mid-century race has largely resolved itself. The modern Russian submarine force has adopted many of the tenets of the Rickover doctrine. They prioritize silence now. They value quality over quantity. The harsh lessons of K-19 and the Kursk have forced a cultural shift toward safety, although the shadow of the past still lingers in the aging infrastructure of their northern bases. But the most profound legacy of the submarine arms race is psychological. The success of the George Washington and her successors created a world where nuclear war became impossible to win. By ensuring that retaliation was guaranteed, the submarine force froze the great powers in a state of permanent hesitation. We live in the peace created by these machines. It is a terrifying peace, built on the promise of mutual suicide, but it has held for 80 years. We go about our daily lives, driving to work, raising children, watching television, completely oblivious to the fact that hundreds of feet beneath the ocean surface, young men are standing watch over missiles that are targeted at our cities. We have the luxury of forgetting them because they do their job so well. The submarine service is the silent service, not just because their ships are quiet, but because their mission requires them to be forgotten. If a ballistic missile submarine is in the news, it means something has gone terribly wrong. Their success is defined by their non-existence in the public consciousness. As we look back at the history of this underwater war, we are left with a disturbing question. Is this stability permanent? The systems built in the 1960s were designed for a bipolar world, two superpowers, rational actors communicating on a hotline. Today, the world is multipolar. China is building a massive fleet of ballistic missile submarines. India, Pakistan, and North Korea are developing the capability. The ocean is getting crowded. The 13-minute war is no longer just a scenario between Washington and Moscow. The launch baskets are everywhere. The warning times are shrinking, and the technology of detection is improving. In the near future, underwater drones and quantum sensors may make the oceans transparent. If submarines can be tracked as easily as surface ships, the invulnerability of the second strike disappears. The stability that the George Washington created could evaporate. We may be returning to the hair-trigger instability of the 1950s, but with more players and deadlier weapons. But for now, the legacy holds. The wreckage of the K-19 has been cut up, its reactor compartment sitting in a storage yard in the Arctic. The George Washington has been melted down. The men like Nikolai Zatayev and James Osborne have passed into history. But the idea remains. The ocean is still a hiding place. In the quiet corners of the Pentagon and the Kremlin, there are still men who look at the blue expanse of the map and see a battlefield. They track the patrols, they count the missiles, they worry about the seals and the welds and the psychological state of the crews. And deep down in the midnight zone where the sunlight never reaches, the patrols continue. The reactor pumps hum, the gyroscopes spin, the crew eats lunch in the mess hall sitting 10 feet away from a silo that contains the fire of the sun. The first shot of the new war was fired in 1960, but the war never ended. It just went deep. It became a permanent feature of our world, a background radiation of danger that we have learned to ignore. As the sun sets over the Atlantic today, the water looks empty. The waves roll in, indifferent to human history. But beneath the surface, the leviathans are there. They are gliding through the dark, waiting for a command that has not come for 60 years. We rely on them to stay silent. We rely on the engineering to hold, on the reactors to cool, and on the men to remain sane. We rely on the legacy of the George Washington and the K-19 to keep the peace. It is a fragile, terrifying, and magnificent legacy. It is the story of how humanity used the ocean to save itself from its own worst inventions. And it is a story that is still being written, one patrol at a time, in the cold, crushing silence of the deep. The story of the submarine arms race is often told as a technological thriller, a sequence of bigger missiles, faster boats, and deeper dives. But at its core, it is a story about the limits of control. The Americans sought control through precision. They built the George Washington with the obsessive care of a watchmaker, creating a system so reliable it became invisible. The Soviets sought control through brute force. They built the Hotel class and the Typhoon with the energy of a blacksmith, hammering out parity through sheer will and sacrifice. Both approaches worked after a fashion. The missiles balanced each other out. The world did not end. But the cost was high. It was paid in the billions of dollars that could have been spent on life rather than death. It was paid in the lives of men like Boris Korchalov, who burned to death to fix a pipe that should have been built right the first time. It was paid in the environmental legacy of the nuclear graveyards in the Arctic. As we stand on the shore and look out at the horizon, we should remember that the emptiness is an illusion. The ocean is full of ghosts, and it is full of machines. The first shot opened a Pandora's box, and we are still living with what came out. The invisible weapon is still there. The only question is how long we can keep it hidden. If this deep dive into the hidden history of the Cold War and the engineering of the apocalypse meant something to you, we'd be honored to have you with us again. Until next time, stay curious and take good care.